Well, good morning, City Hope Church. How are you guys doing today? I want to give a huge welcome to our online crowd as well as all of our crowd that's joining in from all of our different City Hope campuses. Malvis, can we welcome everybody watching today? I hope all of you had an amazing Thanksgiving. I hope that, although probably you share in what Pastor Chris talked about with having too much food and too little belt line, I hope it was a great day for you. Just a couple things. One, don't miss out on this next weekend, this Saturday and this Sunday. We call it Compassion Weekend. It is our kickoff of our Christmas season here at City Hope, and we do big things coming up. And so I hope you're excited. I hope you're ready for it. And the second thing, I'm just going to slip a little something in there because I get to serve as the discipleship pastor, and I'm just going to do it and ask for forgiveness later. We have something huge coming up. And since 2013, we have had a ministry college where individuals from the age of 18 to 27 have got to come in and take classes and get their degree and learn how to actually do this thing that we call ministry. And we've always been wanting to offer these life-changing classes to everybody else who's just hungry to learn and to grow. And starting in January, we are starting something called City Hope College PM, where individuals who are hungry or just wanting to learn more about their Bible or God or theology, they get to come in on Sunday nights and get to sign up and learn more about these things. All you've got to do to sign up or find out more information is to go to cityhope.cc/CHCPM to find out more. Well, I hope you guys are excited to start Christmas. Maybe you've gotten the Christmas tree out. Maybe you've started your Christmas music. Some of you may have started it inappropriately too early. It's 2020, all right? I just needed the Christmas music early. But Thanksgiving itself sometimes comes with a journey. Maybe a part of your Thanksgiving tradition is you going to a family member's house. Maybe this year you weren't able to. But there's a journey that really defined my family, a journey that defined my life. And that was a journey that my mother took. If you and I have never had the chance to meet and to talk through life stories, my mother grew up in southern Laos. Laos is a nation sandwiched between Vietnam and Thailand. During the Vietnam War, her house built on stilts was accidentally bombed by an American bomber. The crater was so large that the little village decided to fill it with water and stock it with fish, and they made a fish pond out of the crater in the lake. But during that time as well, communists were taking over the nation. And so I don't know what you were doing at the age of 15 or 16, but my mother decided to take her brothers and sisters and escape communism outside, and they heard that there was a UN refugee camp across the border in Thailand. And so what my mother did was she ran during the day, she ran during the night and slept during the day and escaped across the border. And it was very risky because communists really don't like people escaping communism for some reason. It was an interesting thing, but the beautiful thing was that during that time over in the United States, God had placed on my father's heart a burden to pray for the safety and the direction of his future wife. He journaled about it. He couldn't explain it, but it was during this exact same period of time. It was a beautiful thing. My mom gets into this UN refugee camp, and she discovers something that many refugees discover that they did not know before, and that is this: when you get to the refugee camp, you are countryless. You can't really go back to the nation that you came from, and you can't enter the country that is hosting the refugee camp. You have to wait for another country to open up its borders and for you to get a refugee visa in order to leave. My mom, although she had never been to the United States, just had this thing in her heart. It was placed there by God, I believe, but had this something in her heart where she wanted to go to the United States. And so my mom, who was 5'0" with lava running through her veins, decides to stick it out in this refugee camp. She hauled cement bags for a couple years. She survives malaria while she's at the camp. And in the midst of all of this, she's so malnourished, and France opens up its borders. So my mom, who's fluent in French, had an opportunity to go, but she said, that's not it. People thought she was crazy, but she said, I feel like I'm waiting for something bigger. I feel like I'm waiting for something else. And eventually the United States granted a few select visas to refugees of the Vietnam War. And my mom was one of those that was allowed to come over. And just so you see a picture of who I'm talking about this waiting, I have a picture of my mom at her citizenship ceremony. It was one of the proudest days of her life, becoming a United States citizen. And because she was willing to wait, somebody else got to come as well. That was me. Still dressed well, all right? So my mom dressed me, all right? She would probably still dress me, all right? But the thing is that waiting is such a vital thing. Waiting is so important. And God seems to be so intent on weaving it into all of our lives. Can I get an amen? We're not good at it either. That's the thing. I wouldn't mind if we were good at waiting, but God seemed to just be really intent on weaving something into our lives, like waiting, that we weren't necessarily gifted or passionate about. And a lot of the times the question is why? See, we've got to go back to the beginning of our story, humanity's story with God. We've got to go back to the beginning. God places us in this perfect environment. He gives us this perfect relationship with Him. We can have perfect fellowship with Him. There's no sickness, no death, no taxes, all right? None of these things are around. And yet we, humanity, we allowed ourselves to be convinced that God was somehow holding out on us, that somehow God was withholding something that we would really desire, that God was getting one over on us. And because of this suspicion, because we allowed ourselves to be deceived in this way, we introduced sin. We introduced rebellion. We introduced brokenness into this beautiful, perfect creation. And like a child standing over a broken vase, we stood there looking at the mess that we made. And I don't know how you view God the Father. I don't know how you view God when you pray to Him. I don't know how you view God when you think about Him. But ultimately, if God was truly begrudging and did not care, if God was just an obligatory God, He would have easily had an opportunity in that moment to wipe His hands clean of us in that moment. And yet here we find the story of a father who steps up and stands next to that child who broke that vase, who broke that world, and says, I will make this right. Someday I am going to send somebody who is going to fix what you cannot fix. And we know that person to be Jesus. And that is why we're so excited to celebrate Christmas again and again every single year. And every generation after that first generation would tell the story of God's promise and tell the story of God's promise. It would be passed on again and again and again to generation after generation. Well, after centuries of waiting for this promise, there slipped in a worry. There slipped in a concern. There slipped in a question that sometimes people were too afraid to vocalize. And it was this: where is this promise? Why is He waiting so long? If this promise was real, wouldn't it have happened already? Why is God taking so long? You see, having Christmas every December can create some amazing distortion in our mind because He kind of comes for us once a year, all right? He kind of comes every single year, but you've got to understand, by the time a 16-year-old girl named Mary rolls around, that not only had there been centuries upon centuries upon centuries of waiting, but there had also been 400 years of silence that had greeted His people. And they found themselves saying, God, where is the promise? And maybe you have found yourself saying that exact same question. God, where is the promise? God, you placed a promise in my heart. Where is this promise? See, this is why it's so important for us to grasp a hold of some traditional Christmas songs like O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appears. That we understand the desperation of the circumstance. And many of you are suffering with that same desperation. Solomon in Proverbs 13 lists an illness, a sickness, but not of the body, of the heart. He says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And maybe you've come in here today and you have been clutching onto a hope. Maybe it's fully realized and you know exactly what God has promised you. Maybe it's just the faint glimmer of a hope where you know that God has greater days and better days ahead of you. And you've been holding on to this, and maybe you've been asking what the Israelites asked for all those years. God, where is the promise? You see, today's message isn't about that wonderful moment where He gives us this great promise. It's a beautiful moment. Today's message is not about this great moment where that one fine day where it all comes true and we see that He keeps His word. Today's message is about the meantime, the time in between, the time between the promise being given and the promise received. That meantime that causes so many of us to stumble, and that meantime sometimes we're so afraid to talk about. You see, the question is, in many of our hearts, and the question that must be asked today is, what do I do if I'm not where I used to be, but I'm not where I know I'm going to be? What do I do in the meantime? And to answer that question, I want to take you to a lake in Israel. I want to take you to a little lake that we call the Sea of Galilee. If you've got your Bibles with you, go ahead and flip to Mark chapter 4. And in Mark chapter 4, there's a story that happens that so perfectly encapsulates this concept. You see, what's happening is that Jesus had just begun his ministry. He had just picked 12 disciples, and he gave them an instruction. And in Mark chapter 4, we see this instruction. In verse 35, it says, "As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let's cross to the other side.'" Now, I want you to take a good look at those two words right there. Hold on to those words in your mind as we go along. He said, "Let's cross over to the other side of the lake." And as Jesus gets in the boat with them, they get to the middle of the lake. Jesus has laid down, he's got his head on a cushion, he's fallen asleep, and suddenly a storm that is so bad that sailors and fishermen who have been on the water since they could walk are afraid for their lives. And what do? They go to wake Jesus up, and they say the statement, "Don't you care what happens to us? Don't you care?" Jesus stands up, rebukes the wind and the waves, and they obey him immediately. And it settles down, and they look at each other, and the disciples say to each other, "What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" And so here in this moment, we see this beautiful moment happen, but it's all happening in the middle of the lake. It's all happening in the meantime. And then we have the beginning of chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "So they arrived at the other side of the lake." I want you to look at those words, the other side, because anything that is not the other side, the meantime, isn't really treated well in our culture. Our culture is such a highlight-orientated culture. It's such a highlight-oriented culture. You can even get apps that cut out all of the extras of a 1-minute video to where it's like 30 seconds of a video clip that somebody shares, because we're so obsessed with highlights. We're so obsessed with it. We are taught to aspire to reach the other side. We're taught to aspire to it so much so that we spend our time and our thoughts fixating about the other side. But if you don't get anything else from me today, I want you to hear this, that the meantime matters. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. The meantime matters. Otherwise, he wouldn't have placed you there. The meantime matters, and it matters for a huge, gigantic reason. Now, back to the subject of promises for a moment, because as I started, we talked about promises. And the question that I find myself asking is, why does God deal in promises? Why is he so obsessed with giving us promises? Theologically and technically, he is not obligated to give us any kind of promise. He owes us nothing. And yet you will find, perhaps you have been just starting your relationship with God. We're so excited for you. As you walk with him, what will happen is that before long, like a seed in your heart, God will give you a personal promise. And it may be fully realized, and you may know exactly what it means, or it may be just this hope in your heart that God begins to add to and add to and add to over the years that he walks you through it. Or perhaps you have been walking with Christ for some time, and he has given you a promise and you are holding on for that promise. Or perhaps you have been able to get to the other side, that you've walked with him, you've made it through the meantime, and you have seen that God is a man of his word, that God keeps his word. Perhaps you have, but the question is, why does he choose to deal in promises? And the simple answer is because God cares more about the depth and the strength and the beauty of his relationship with you more than anything else. And it's in the meantime that beautiful relationships are made. Relationships worth having aren't built over first date questions and Aladdin genie relationships. Relationships worth having are built by spending years taking hold of a nail-scarred hand and walking through waiting rooms and delivery rooms, through dark times and through bright times, through times of great certainty and times where I don't know, God, what you are doing, but I know whose hand I am holding. That's how beautiful relationships are built. That's why relationships worth having are being built. And that's why many of us don't have a relationship with God that we know we should, because it costs something. It costs our commitment to the meantime. It costs our commitment to what God wishes to do and make between us in our lives. This is why James is encouraging the early church, hey, I know God is placing many of you in meantimes, but hold on. He says this in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. He says, dear brothers and sisters, whenever trouble comes your way, let it be an opportunity for joy. For when your faith is tested, hold on to that word, when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So he encourages us in this next verse, and he says, so let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be strong in character and ready for anything. This word tested in the Greek has a depth and a richness to it. It's the Greek word dokimion, all right? And so I want you to take a look at this word. It simply means this in the Greek. It means the proving, that which is tried or proved. A test. And Peter thought so much of this word that he decided to use it in 1 Peter. And he says this in chapter 1, verse 7. He says, these trials are only to test your faith, to show that it is strong and pure. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, and your faith is far more precious to God than mere gold. You see, if there's something I know about tests is that you can pass them, and that there's a wonderful feeling about passing a test and hearing the well done. But if there's something else I know about tests is that they can be failed or they can be prolonged. And I find that in the meantime, there are three tendencies that often happen that cause us to either fail these tests or prolong them. None of us wakes up in the morning saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to fail the test from God today. Going to do it, all right? I'm going to be a failure today. None of us want to do that. And yet, there are some tendencies that creep into our meantime that cause us to often prolong that meantime or to fail that meantime. The first tendency, very simply, is doing too much. Doing too much. Now, this is my weakness, if I could be vulnerable for a second. This is where I struggle in the meantime, because I'm an individual that feels that if I run into a wall or a problem, that I can outwork it. I'll wake up earlier, I'll stay up later, I'll figure it out. I will outwork a problem, but you can't outwork the meantime. You can't get to the other side by your own effort. You can't do it. As a matter of fact, if you have gotten to the other side by your own effort, then the other side that you think the other side is probably not the other side. Probably not. Now, a little disclaimer on this, and maybe there might be somebody who pops into your mind as soon as I describe this, but there are people that many of us know who get into the boat when Jesus says, get into the boat, we're going to the other side, and they do not put an oar into the water. They cross their arms and they say, when God wants me over on the other side, he'll get me over to the other side. But here's the thing, is that the disciples wouldn't even have gotten to the meantime, the middle part, without working, without oaring, without partnering their work with his command. And so here's the thing, you can't outwork the meantime, but it is important that we partner with God during this. But doing too much is often a trap when we are looking to our own efforts to get us out of the meantime. Some of us spend so much time trying to get out of tests and get out of trials. I look back at my life and wonder where I would be and who I would be had I dedicated myself to passing the test rather than investing all my energy in getting out of the test that God gave me. I truly wonder about that. So the first tendency in the meantime is to do too much. The second tendency, and this may stick a little bit, but it's so important that we hear this. The second tendency is camping out in the meantime. Unfortunately, we live in a world where disappointment is a powerful force, and the fear of disappointment is almost just as powerful. And many individuals have camped out in the meantime and have spent their efforts convincing themselves that the meantime is actually the other side. And if I could look at the lake, which is our world, and the Big C Church, I would see so many boats that are in the middle of the lake, and they are convinced that they are on the other side because they've convinced themselves. But there's something about this. If you do this, there's something about this where you are not fully settled if you convince yourself. You can't really convince yourself it. There's something that's just fake and plastic about convincing yourself about this, because we're created for the other side. We were made for the other side. We were made to receive the promises of God. We were made to understand and receive the completion of his promises. It's a key part of our relationship with God. And so today, if you're in here and you have found yourself convincing yourself that the meantime is the other side because of disappointment or fear of disappointment, today I want to encourage you. It's time to lay down your disappointment. It's time to lay down your fear of disappointment, and it's time to take hold of his promise again. And so that's the second tendency in the meantime. The third tendency that can cause us to either prolong the meantime or fail the meantime test, the third one is descending into a survival or victim's posture. You see, the meantime is dangerous because of one simple thing: cynicism. It can build in our hearts. I don't know about you, but I've been in meantime moments before, and I've seen other individuals receive the promise from God when my situation seemed that much more dire and that much more just desperate. And I found myself almost naturally descending into either a victim's mentality, I've somehow been shorted by God, or cynicism and jadedness, where I find myself even limiting what types of prayers I'm willing to pray. That when individuals ask for large prayer requests, and would you partner with me in prayer, there's something in the back of my mind that goes, yeah, I don't know if you're gonna do that. And it's amazing what settles in our heart during the meantime, that we'll even question God's care for us. As a matter of fact, take a look at Mark chapter 4, verse 38, and this is in the middle of the storm. Jesus was sleeping in the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. Frantically, they woke him, shouting, "Teacher, don't you even care that we're going to drown?" You see, the meantime often will build a cynicism inside of us that questions if he even cares about us. And what it does is it ruins our childlike faith. That Jesus speaks so well and so highly of having childlike faith that it's impossible to receive the kingdom of God without faith like a child. And so we have to ask ourselves, if we start out like that, how do we end up without it? Often, in the meantime, if we're not careful, a cynicism and jadedness is built in that causes us to, one, not see the Father correctly, and two, it causes us to fail or prolong our meantimes. I do not believe that you can make it to the other side full of jadedness and full of cynicism. I believe that you must lay it down and ask God, hey, can I take your hand again and believe in your promises fully again? That we must come to him in this way like a child. It's a powerful thing, and sometimes the silence of the meantime gets to us. Sometimes the most unnerving part of the meantime is the silence of it all. That perhaps you have entered into the meantime, and the most frustrating thing is that God has seemed to grow quiet, that he seemed to grow silent. And I wish to tell you that silence is often a great indication that you are in a test. Why do I say that? Ladies and gentlemen, because the teacher never talks when he gives a test. The teacher never talks when he gives a test. And ladies and gentlemen, folks, the enemy will work overtime in your meantime to make the silence of God appear to be the neglect of God. But if you'll look closely, he hasn't let go. If you look closely, he is a promise keeper, not just a promise giver. If you'll look closely, you will see eyes that are intent on you passing the test. Eyes that are intent like a child watching a father watching a child walk for the first time, hoping and hoping and hoping that this is the time that it happens and this is the time that it works. You will see those eyes willing you on. You see, it's time that we pass the tests, the meantimes that he's given us. And as I close, I'm reminded of a story that really illustrates this, a story that really drives deep in my heart that things are not always as they appear. I love the quote that says that if your heart is not anchored in the goodness of God, you will lower your theology to match your pain. And it's time that some individuals in this room take up hope again, that he is a promise keeper. There's a story that happened during World War II, a true story. There was a man named Lieutenant John Blanchard, and he was in New York City about to be shipped off to Europe, about to be shipped over there to fight the Germans. He couldn't sleep the night before he was shipped off. He'd heard too many stories. He was afraid. And so he found himself at a 24-hour library. One of the only people in there. He was walking through the different sections and found himself grabbing a book that seemed interesting enough. He checks out this book, and as he's flipping through it that evening, as he still can't sleep, he realizes there's something different about this book. This book doesn't just have printed letters. It has written letters that somebody who owned this book before took the time to write in the columns and write in the margins their thoughts. It was not only profound, the thoughts that this person had, but it was the most beautiful handwriting he'd ever seen. And so he flips to the front of the book and he sees that the previous owner's name is printed in the front and an old address, Miss Hollis Meynell. And so Lieutenant John Blanchard does something crazy. Lieutenant John Blanchard takes a piece of paper and writes a letter. Dear Miss Hollis Meynell, my name is Lieutenant John Blanchard. I'm about to be shipped over to Europe, and I found your book at this public library. All my friends have girls that back at home that they're writing to, and I really don't have anybody to write to. And I'm writing you to ask, would you be willing to be somebody that I could write to during the war? Sincerely, Lieutenant John Blanchard. He really didn't know why he was doing this. He wasn't one of those people that did things like this. But with an envelope, a stamp, and a prayer, he puts the letter in the mail as he ships off. A week goes by, 2 weeks go by. And finally, on the third-ish week, his name is called over mail call, and he runs over to see what it is, and there's an envelope, and he doesn't even have to see the name. He recognizes the handwriting. It's from Miss Hollis Meynell. He opens the envelope and opens the letter. What is he about to find? And it's a letter addressed to him, and it says, Dear Lieutenant John Blanchard, thank you for your letter. It's crazy that you found my book. Yes, I would be honored to write to you during this war. Sincerely, Miss Hollis Meynell. Well, one letter turned to 2 letters, turned to 3, turned to weeks and weeks of writing one another. And before long, it wasn't just a friendship that was budding. It wasn't just a let me get to know you that was budding. Before long, he found himself waiting and hanging on the next letter. He found himself so in love with this person that he'd never met. This doesn't happen over letters. I'm not one of these people that does stuff like this. And so because adult guys turn into 5-year-olds when we get us together, all of the guys in the barracks knew about this girl as well. And so finally, the teasing began. Dude, you don't even know if she could be like 80 years old, man. Like she could be like the ugliest person you'd ever met in your entire life. Like how do you know who this person is? And so he takes a risk. He encloses a picture of himself in the next letter, and he says, Dear Miss Hollis Meynell, I've put a picture of myself here in this letter so that you know who you're writing to. I would love it if you would enclose a picture of yourself so that I may know who I'm writing to. Sincerely, Lieutenant John Blanchard. He sends it off, and a week goes by, and another week, and another week. He's getting nervous. And finally a letter comes. All the guys in the barracks gather around as he opens the envelope. And I don't know if you've ever gotten like a birthday card where you kind of shook it to see if there was money or like a gift card inside before you actually read it. He shakes the letter and nothing falls out. And so he opens the letter and he reads, as the guys are giving it to him, Dear Lieutenant John Blanchard, thank you for your picture. You're so handsome in your uniform. I was about to enclose a picture of myself, but then I thought, if you have truly meant all the things you have said you felt about me, then how I look really doesn't matter. Sincerely, Miss Hollis Meynell. And all the guys together in the barracks, together let him have it. Dude, she's ugly. Dude, no, like she's not gonna let you see how there's only one reason why somebody would do that. And disappointed and heartbroken and a little bit embarrassed, he decides to set down the pen. He sets it down, but for some reason, he can't get his mind away from the writings. For some reason, he can't get himself away from the correspondence. And so, against his better judgment, he picks up the pen again and begins writing. And that writing continued all the way until Germany surrendered. He got his orders. He was going to be shipped across the Atlantic, and he was going to be back in New York City. And so he writes one last letter. Dear Miss Hollis Meynell, as you've heard, the Germans have surrendered, and I'm going to be shipped back home. I am going to be in Grand Central Station on this day at this time, and I would love to meet you and to take you to dinner. Sincerely, Lieutenant John Blanchard. P.S. I will know you, or you will know me, because I will be carrying the book, and I will know who you are, because you'll be wearing a red rose on your lapel. He sends the letter without time to get a letter back from her. And as he's going across the Atlantic, he's getting nervous. As he lands in New York City port, he's getting nervous. As he gets on the train to go to Grand Central Station, he's getting nervous. And I don't know about you, but I would not be sitting down in the train seats. I would be looking out the window as the train pulled up. And as the train pulls up, he steps out onto the platform. And in his own words, to his left, he saw summer in poetry in motion. As a girl in a green dress, the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen, blonde curls bouncing as she walked from left to right in front of him. And as he instinctively took a step towards her, she looked back over her shoulder, smiled, and said, "Are you going my way, sailor?" And as he leaned in closer, almost instinctively to follow her, he realized there was no red rose on her lapel. And then he said, "I saw her." Off to his left. She was pushing 60, maybe 70 years old, with greasy gray hair tucked inside of a worn-out hat. And he had a decision to make there in the moment as Miss Summer is getting further and further and further away, as people are jumping off of the train and the platform is getting more and more crowded. And as he's losing her, he had a decision to make. Do I follow that? Or do I keep my word? And he straightens up his tie. He straightens himself up and takes a deep breath and steps towards the woman with the red rose on her lapel. He extends his hand and says, "Hello, ma'am. My name is Lieutenant John Blanchard. You must be Miss Hollis Meynell. It would be my honor to take you to dinner." And the woman turned with the most annoyed look on her face and said, "I don't know what this is all about, but the woman in the green dress begged me to wear this red rose and said that if you were to ask me to dinner, that she would be across the street in the diner waiting for you." Although that's a true story, here's the beautiful thing, is that the Bible says no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can comprehend what God has in store for those who love him. And he, with his own hand and with his own pen, is writing your story, ladies and gentlemen. And it's time that we take this meantime and we pass it, that we build relationships with God worth having, that we look to the Father and our view of his goodness is restored in that moment, that we drop our jadedness and our cynicism and our disappointment and our fear of disappointment at the cross. And we say, "Why don't you have the things I can't explain, Lord? This is how I want to see you." Today it's time that we become a people who pass the test. Let me pray for you. Father, today, I thank you that you are a good God and a good Father, and you are not out of the business of writing beautiful stories that take our breath away. Lord, I thank you for the promises that have been given out in this room, whether fully realized word for word promises or just a seed of greater hope for the future. God, I thank you that these promises are here and that you are the promise keeper. Lord, I pray that in every single worship center at City Hope and that in every single living room that is watching the service, may you restore hope, may you restore childlike faith, and may we be the people that pass the test. We love you. Oh, we thank you. In your name, amen.